Good morning. Welcome to Viewpoint, your program of personalities, politicians, and perspectives. Viewpoint always starts each Wednesday morning with a kudo or two. And I think today it'd be appropriate for the old man to offer a big kudo to the folks who manage the place where he lives out at the Christian Village in the west side of town. COVID, a big name for everybody. It has been for a year now. We're all running around looking over our shoulders. And the Christian Village has made arrangements now that the vaccine is available for some. For those of us who live out there to receive the vaccine if we wish. So, kudos to those folks. This pandemic thing has created a lot of problems for a lot of people, not the least of which is folks who manage healthcare facilities such as ours. So I want to tip my hat in their direction and give them a snappy salute. Let's get right down to business this morning. We have a guest that I'm particularly fond of and have been for years. I don't know how many years, I've forgotten now. So, Judith K., you go ahead and introduce our guest this morning. Well, all right. She's passing the ball back to Bill this morning. The pleasure I take this morning is that sitting here looking at a young man whose grandfather pushed the waves before him in the legal profession and was a very prominent lawyer and, more importantly, a friend of mine and lived a block away. And here we are. We've gone down through my finish line, and somebody's drawing a tape across it, and I'm not sure when it's going to happen. There's a few hurdles that I have to jump between now and the finish line, but it gives me great pleasure to introduce to our radio audience this morning Mr. Blinn Bates, another attorney here in Logan County, and he's going to tell us about how to save your money in estates and so forth. Or maybe he's going to tell you about some unusual office calls he's had. Maybe we better waive that program. So, good morning, Blinn. How are you? It's nice to have you with us this morning, son.
Morning. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
It's kind of interesting this morning. We've gone full circle. I knew your father when he was your age, a lot younger. I knew him when we were in high school. We used to play football on Lincoln Avenue out there, and it was tackle on the boulevard and tag on the streets. And I have to confess here to God and everybody on the airways that once in a while we kicked the football into one of those light bulbs out there. And so we go back a long way. Let's talk about the history of your law firm, Blinn. So I'll pass the baton to you, sir.
Well, it's been around for a while.
Well, you have too.
I have too. Right. Our particular firm, I guess, was started around 1972, and that was when my grandfather joined Bob Woods in the Woods, and they started what's now known as Woods and Bates. And in the early years, there were some other attorneys that worked there, and you probably knew some of them. And fast forward a little bit, my dad came back and worked for Bob and my grandfather in 1979, and he was there for many years. And when I graduated law school, I came back, and that was in 2008. I went to work for my dad, and he retired. I think his official retirement date was 2018, but that was a 3 or 4 year process, if I recall.
2018. You know, Judy and Jim and both of you listeners out there, I recall when this young man passed his bar exam and was admitted to the bar, and there's a little service they have down there, and I went down to watch this young man being sworn in, and it was a very interesting thing. And his father gave a few remarks on behalf of the particular class, and I was very impressed. Your dad did a heck of a job on that, and he was proud to stand there and see his son become a full-fledged member of the Illinois Bar Association. I believe he was there at the behest of Justice Rita Garman, whom I respect very much, and so a little bit of history there. So, what would be, Mr. Bates, the bulk of your practice? Estate planning,
That's the bulk of what I do. I do a lot of estate planning, a lot of estate administration, trust administration. Have gotten into a lot of real estate work, and that's my part of the practice. We have another attorney named Michael Fleshman that joined the firm in 2017.
Is that in relation to the Fleshmans locally?
Yes. He's
Good.
from Lincoln.
That's great. Yeah.
Born and raised in Lincoln, and came back. He was working in Springfield for a while, and then decided he wanted to get back closer to home. So it has worked out really well. He's been with us.
That's great.
Over 3 years now.
Yeah.
So he does a lot of custody and divorce type work, and some of the juvenile type work we were talking about before we got on the air. Mm-hmm. And he handles some different things, some of the same things, and we've stayed relatively busy. Mm-hmm.
Now, if clients XYZ walks in and their husband dropped dead suddenly and didn't leave a will, that's a pretty tough. Where do you start with a client like that?
Well, if somebody doesn't have a will or doesn't have an estate plan set up, we have to look to the great state of Illinois to see what we're going to do.
That's pretty scary.
They dictate how you're supposed to handle that.
It's a little more than a little scary.
Which brings us to the point, by the way, we should emphasize the need for estate planning. I presume that there's a minimum down there somewhere where a person doesn't need somebody to handle their affairs for them. But it's extremely important for a man and or a lady to be planning ahead. It's just like kid having Don Peasley look at me with a gleam in his eye every time he sees me. We never know. And so I'm trying to. I don't want to be facetious about this at all. Planning for your family is ought to be as simple as, not as simple, but as routine as brushing your teeth in the morning, because you're doing your family a terrible service, even if you don't have much of an estate.
I think so, and I think that it's not a comfortable conversation by any means. I mean, it's not something that people like to think about. We don't like to think about what's going to happen if I'm not here anymore. It's not fun to think about, but it's inevitable. I mean, each and every one of us are going to pass away at some point or another. And what's going to happen?
Well, there are those who have high-level political appointments who don't think they will, though. You may have to make some new laws for that.
But it's going to happen, and a lot of the time you think of maybe money or investments or things like that as your estate, but there's a lot more to it than that, in my opinion. I mean, you have things that are valuable to you that you need to plan for. Like, I have children. If something happened to my wife and I, what's going to happen to those kids? And if I don't indicate in some way what I want to have happen, it's going to be up for debate at that point. And that's how you see a lot of argument. And you've got things that are assets, if you will, that aren't necessarily money. You have personal belongings. You have maybe family photo albums, family Bibles, and a lot of that stuff now is electronic. So that's opened up this whole new world of dealing with electronic photos and electronic accounts and all these things that you got to plan for that too, because maybe nobody knows my passwords and things like that. They don't know how to access those things. So how do we get into that? Those are new problems with estate planning and estate administration.
I couldn't imagine where you were headed with that. I'm not very good at, I'm lousy at any kind of technology. But I can understand where you're coming from, because, of course, my kids are all very conversant with it. That's changed things a bit in the world of lawyering, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, you have, a lot of the business we do now is by email. You have email accounts, and every email account you have has passwords. And I've read accounts of where, somebody passed away, and, it was actually, in this instance, it was a gentleman that was in the military, and his parents were trying to get access to his email account, because that was kind of, how they had their correspondence and things like that, and had a heck of a time trying to get it because they didn't know the passwords and things like that. And those are some of the things I talk to people about now, about keeping lists of your passwords somewhere where somebody can get it, somebody knows how to get it, keeping all that information too, because we do all of our banking. A lot of us in my generation do banking electronically. We do everything electronically.
Right.
I open up this phone, and with the touch of my finger, it lets me into everything because all that stuff's stored in here. But once that finger's not there anymore, somebody needs to know how to get to it.
Amen. Leave your finger if you decide to go.
Yeah, that could be a little bit morbid, probably.
So, define your terms, if you would, Blinn. Estate planning. That involves more than who's going to get Grandma's old dresser.
I think it does. I think it's more, in my mind, of an all-encompassing, how are we going to deal with everything that I'm dealing with right now while I'm alive when I'm not here anymore? If that be my children, my financial related assets, my personal property, all my accounts, what do we want to do with that, and who's going to take care of it?
Yeah.
So who's going to be the one that I want to say, you need to deal with this? And there's more to it than that too, and it's more than just when I'm gone. It's also, in the world we live in, it's while I'm still here if I can't do it. We've seen in the last, it's been almost a year now, but in the last year, with the uncertainty of this virus and everything, people are becoming incapacitated, and they can't deal with what they need to deal with while they're still alive. So who's going to do that? Those are discussions in that conversation too.
And am I correct in this? I want to be careful how I phrase this. If I should die and have not made arrangements with the Bates law firm, intestate, I think, is that the word they use?
That's correct.
Die see, you thought I just had a pretty face. Seriously, I don't want to be facetious about this. This is a serious matter for families. If a person dies without a will, and they've not made any provisions at all, am I correct in saying that if the estate is significant, and there are a lot of significant estates here in Logan County, that money would go to the government? Tell me what happens to...
So it wouldn't necessarily go to the government, but it would go to... It could. If you had a significant estate, you have things like estate tax you need to worry about.
Farmland.
Planning, things like that. Right, with the price of farmland, that comes into play. But the statutes in the state of Illinois dictate at that point what would happen to it. So there's a section in the statute that says and outlines who your heirs at law would be. And your heirs at law would be the people that would inherit in the event that you didn't have an estate plan set up ahead of time. So for me, personally, if I died without a will or estate planning or anything like that, my estate needed to go through the probate process and be distributed. The people that would ultimately be the beneficiaries for me would be my spouse and my children, and they would share equally. So my spouse would get half, and my kids would get half. They would split half. But that changes depending on your own circumstances, I only have 2 children, so they're each going to get a fourth. If I had 3, they'd get, a third of a half. So
yes,
a sixth.
I won't do the math on that.
You can get a calculator to figure that out.
Right. But that, that's not necessarily the way that most people would envision it to be, I don't think. I think as a nuclear family, I guess, most of the time you would say, I want my spouse to have what I have when I'm gone, and then I want it to go to my kids. That would be typical. If you have a some sort of mixed family where you have some stepchildren that have come into the mix, or you have a second marriage and things like that, and a lot of people consider them to be their children. The law doesn't. So those people aren't necessarily going to be beneficiaries at that point, and that's where a lot of that planning becomes really, really important.
Unless you so designate.
Correct.
Now, what's the difference, or what are the similarities between estates and trusts?
There's a whole raft of different types of trusts. Okay, so you can create a trust during your lifetime. You can create a trust after you're gone. You could fund it through your will. But I would say the large majority of the time, the trusts that we see when we talk about trusts are trusts that people have created when they're alive. And so they would create a trust, and the best way to think about it is that it's a separate entity. So we have Blinn Bates, the entity, and then we would have the trust, Blinn Bates Trust. So the trust would be separate. And the way that the trust most normally works is the trust is funded with assets. So we would transfer, money into there, or we would deed real estate into there, and then the trust would own those assets, and the trust document itself then would dictate what's going to happen to that. So it could pay income to somebody, it could distribute at death, those types of things is what the trust could do. And they can be, again, they can be varied in any number of ways. But when somebody's doing that, a lot of times they're doing that because they want to maybe avoid having to have a will go through the probate process. So
what would that benefit you? Avoiding probate.
There's pluses and minuses to each. So if I die and I have a will and I need that will to be administered through the probate process, it's a very it's a somewhat strict process. So when you ask the court to admit that will to probate, you say, here's who the will says the executor is. You need to appoint them and things like that. And there's time periods that you have to give notices, and it follows a timeline, whereas you're not going to necessarily have to do that in a trust. And there's pluses and minuses to each, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Blinn, speaking of following a timeline, once again, the old fella and his first lady here sit here, we get engrossed in talking to our guest, and we forgot we have a timeline called sponsoring. So we're going to recognize them right now. Go right ahead, Mr. Rash. And we're right back live in the studios here in WLCN, high on a windy hill here at County Road 2250. Our guest this morning at Viewpoint is Mr. Blinn Bates, a young man whom I admire very much, and matter of fact, in a quasi way, almost part of my family. Grew up with his father and his grandfather, and I didn't grow up with his dad. His dad's much younger than I am. But in any event, we're happy to have. When we're talking about how to handle your money when you die, which is a terribly important thing. Which reminds me, Blinn, of the old story about the curmudgeon that insisted that his wife bury all the money with him. It was mine, by God, and I earned it, and I'm going to take it with me. So it came time, and they buried him, and one of her friends said, "You didn't bury that money." Well, certainly I did. I wrote him a check. What should be a good way to handle people like that? We've talked about trust and a form of trust. I wanted to talk about the Woods Foundation. Bob and Joanne Jarrett Woods saw fit to leave some money, a considerable amount of money, for the good of the community. And at that, I will leave it and pass the baton to Blinn to talk about the Woods Foundation, because they have done a lot of good. Go right ahead, Blinn.
They certainly have. The Woods were extremely generous people when they were alive. I'm sure you knew them. I'm sure you were familiar with them. And I don't know how, I was obviously young, so I don't know how well known their charitable endeavors were when they were alive, but I think they did a lot of that.
They did
anonymously.
Yes.
But when they got up in years, they created the charitable foundation known as the Woods Foundation, and they funded that with all their own money. And they were somewhat active in that when they were still alive. I think Joan was more active than Bob was. Bob passed away in 1998, and they put this money in this foundation, and the purpose of the foundation is to support causes in the community, and that's kind of what we do. My dad and Dave Gollwitzer and Mike Abbott were on the board of the foundation when it was getting going, and Mike Abbott passed away, obviously, and then it left my dad and Dave and Joan, and when Joan passed away, it was just my dad and Dave, and so myself and Dave's son Chris joined the board many years ago now, and we've kind of been just trying to carry on the tradition of giving and generosity of the Woods, and I think they've done some tremendous things in the community, while they were alive and still.
Well, it's a form of giving back to your community. Some people are unable to do it in a larger way. Some people can do it in a smaller way. Some people are like my friend here, my co-host, who will maybe not write a check, but do a lot of personal volunteering. And that's a volunteering that gives to the community just as much as writing a check. So I mention that because we're all in this thing together. This COVID thing has called attention to the fact that we're all in one big family here in Logan County. So think in terms of being a little a benefactor, if you will, please, as you think about your final days. Take care of your family first, but remember the community. Bob and Joanne Jarrett Woods did a heck of a job, and to this day is continuing to help a huge amount. Blinn, what's the first question you ask somebody when they come in and they want to plan their demise?
Say, what's your address?
Or what will be your address?
No, I obviously ask a lot of preliminary questions about.
Yeah, sure. They're routine questions you have to have.
With family and, things like that. And then we kind of get into the meat of what would you want to have happen to what you own when you're not here anymore, and kind of just general questions of what we want to have happen and who we want to take care of those things, and then we would get into how are we going to make that work, whether that's we need a trust or we need a will or we need to change some ownership on accounts or we want to change our beneficiaries, because that all becomes really important too, when I talk about the big picture, because we could sit down and I could do a will for you and you could tell me I want to leave everything I own to Judy, and
thank you.
I'm in trouble there.
Your wife would not be happy about that. But, if you had accounts that listed other people as beneficiaries, that's all going to take precedence over what your will says. So it's important to look at all that, and you may have things that you own jointly with other people that's going to go to them automatically too. So it's not necessarily just what the document says. You've got to look at all of the big picture to make sure everything's going to happen.
So don't go into your lawyer unprepared, folks. Think about if he's going to help you, you're going to have to help him, or she, as the case may be. We do have some nice lady lawyers around. The matter of money, other people's money, is a little touchy for some folks.
It does crazy things to people.
It raises a crazy factor with some people.
Yeah, right.
How do you handle a client? You mentioned such and such a family member. Now, do you want to take no? And then he has nasty things to say about the family member. How do you handle that? Just kind of gloss it over and move on to the next subject?
Yeah, when it comes to leaving your assets to beneficiaries, for the most part, you have a lot of leeway. You can do, this is America still, you can do just about anything you want to. You can't write out completely a spouse. You can't write out completely minor children. You can't write out completely children that depend on you, if they're disabled and things like that. But other than that, and outside of that, you have a lot of leeway. So, if I want to leave a substantial amount of money to charity, and I'm a single individual that doesn't have any of those obligations, then I can do that. But I have to put it in writing. I have to do that. I have to make the steps like the Woods did, and sometimes that involves a lot of planning and a lot of work. I mean, what they did was not something that they just decided one day and
They got
happened
up on
overnight.
Tuesday and thought they'd write that
thought.
up. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you take, for instance, our own hospital. When they have need for money, and it isn't that every day, of course. But when you had the drive for the Abraham Lincoln Hospital, the Woods Foundation was able to substantially help in that. And so as you plan your own estates, some are going to be not so modest. You have to think in terms of our community. And, of course, that's where a good lawyer will come in and making suggestions to a client as to how they may or want to or not want to handle their money.
And I think some of that, too, is going to depend on your stage in life. I mean, when you're somebody that's in your 20s, you're not married, you don't have any children and things like that, your obligations and the things that you're going to need to think about are going to be a lot less than somebody that might be in their 40s and have several children.
Dependent
and,
children.
They have dependents, and how are we gonna make sure we have enough money to send these kids to college if something happens to me, or how is my spouse that stays at home and cares for these kids, how's she going to earn income when I'm not here anymore if I can't do it?
Right.
Those types of things need to be considered too. Do I need to get life insurance? Do I need to get disability insurance? As I start to get older and we start to see all these people that now need to go in nursing homes and the cost of the nursing home care, should I be thinking about long-term care insurance? How is that going to affect my finances when I get to that stage in life? Because I've seen it, I'm sure you guys have seen it, when people get to the age and to the stage in life where they need to start paying for nursing home care, it's horrendously expensive. We saw it with my grandfather had Alzheimer's, and that's specialized care that people have to get, and it's really, really expensive, and it's not going down.
No,
Not
anything like that.
And that could bankrupt somebody in a period of 2 to 3 years, if they're not adequately prepared for it.
With this pandemic, excuse me, go right ahead, Judith.
A family, by its very nature, consists of people of different ideas, different goals, different standards, different everything. They're all individuals. How do you make things fair, and how do you be assured of the fact that the people will all accept and consider one another?
Well, that doesn't always happen.
Well, I
Without naming names.
Is that a big one?
I can't say that we have found that magic wand yet, but I mean, my advice would be to anybody that, in my experience, the more communication you have, the better. I mean, it's when there's surprises, I think, that there's controversy. If everybody knows what to expect when the time comes, they're going to be a lot less likely to be surprised and be hurt or be offended or things like that. And I think that having those family discussions about that, as painful as that can be sometimes, are really, really important. This is what we have, or this is where our important documents are. Here's our safe deposit box key. Here's what we intend to do. We want to make a gift to charity. The kids you guys are really successful, and you don't need the money. We've worked really hard for this, and this is why we want to do what we're going to do. And I think that those types of discussions become important. And there's no guarantee that there's not going to be controversy, but I think that,
a good lawyer has to be a psychologist.
And communication
and I don't mean
is
and
the
I don't
ticket.
mean that in a facetious way. Seriously, a man or a lady in a law office who's handling an estate, they have to know people or how to handle people, and that's another part of law that they probably don't teach as far as formal classes work is concerned.
That's true. Yeah, they teach a lot of theory. They don't teach a lot of practice. I think that's changing in the legal field. I think they're teaching more practice. But
two questions, not necessarily one after the other. This pandemic thing, has that changed things in the practice of law? Have you seen things arise that you had not anticipated at all because of this pandemic?
I would say that it's changed things pretty dramatically. Some good, some bad. You know, there's some good things I think that have come from it. I think we've been forced as a profession to kind of get in the modern age. You know, a lot of the legal field, I think, is behind the times technologically and things like that, which we've been forced to deal with. Mm-hmm. You know, we've been forced to have Zoom hearings, for instance, you know, where we can do things online and have everybody appear by computer rather than being in person, which I think, you know, I hope that some of that continues. You know, when you have things that aren't contested, it saves everybody a whole lot of time, energy, and effort, you know, just to pull up a Zoom conference on your computer rather than travel to the courthouse and get all that done. But, you know, some of it is more difficult that way. If it's contested, you know, that's a hard way to do it, I think. Meeting with people, you know, we haven't really met with people for the most part for several months now, and that's been difficult, you know, just trying to get documents to people to get signed, and some of that we've been able to do electronically, and some of that's good. I mean, getting into that technology and getting into that world, but it's good as far as it works. When it doesn't work, it's a problem.
You know, speaking of technology, in the old days, back in my time, Judith, Golden County Title Company, Blinn R. Parker, an icon, if I ever knew an icon, and he drew up these physically drew up abstracts, and they were a work of art. But now, in today's times, you don't have an abstract per se, do we?
You don't necessarily, well, we still do have some, but you don't necessarily get one. If you're going to buy real estate, you would get a title commitment. And what the title insurer has done is essentially they've gone and they've searched the record title.
Done their title search.
Just as they would have with an abstract. You know, they've done that. You just don't have that big physical abstract anymore. And then they insure the title and the buyer is what they do, and they issue a title insurance policy, which is, you know, 5 to 10 pages rather than big and thick. And those abstracts used to be reviewed by attorneys, and the attorneys would go through them and they'd say, yes, Mr. Gossett, the title we believe is clear on this piece of property, and you're safe to pay your money. Yeah.
Well, you know, Lynn was unique. He really was a unique gentleman. He could quote you who drew up an abstract on 214 Peoria Street back in 1918 and tell you the details of it. He really was an amazing gentleman. Those, you know, that practice was an art, and that's gone now. Do you have people that think that they can be their own lawyer by going online? That has to be a problem, by the way.
Well, I equate a lot of that to, you know, people that go on to WebMD and then go into the doctor and tell them what's wrong with them.
You know? Well, there's that to be said.
I feel bad for the doctors, but you know, there's some good that's come of that. You know, there's some really, really routine things that people might be able to do, but I think when you get into practicing law, there's a reason that people go to school for 7 years to be doctors
and pay a lot of money
and things. You know, that it's a different world. You know, it's a different system. It's a different world, and if it's not done correctly, it can cause a lot of problems, a lot of heartache.
Has the rampant use of technology changed the picture in your profession?
I think it's changed the profession to the extent that it's sped it up dramatically. And when I say sped it up, the pace of business today compared to even the pace of business 10 years ago is exponentially quicker, because you'll send an email and that email is instantaneous, rather than I sent a letter and Mr. Gossett's going to get my letter in
3 days, maybe.
Right
Yeah.
now, maybe 10. I don't know.
Maybe 10. Yeah, right.
But
Give or take.
and he could respond instantaneously to my email. So we've now taken what would normally have taken 5 to 10 days, and we've done it in a matter of 5 to 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you multiply that by, tens or hundreds of people, it speeds it up dramatically. And you've got FedEx. You can do things overnight. You can.
Once again, we get engrossed with our interesting guest, and we forget that we have a phone number that people might have a question. He won't charge you, folks. If you go through his front door, you're liable to get charged, because that's the nature of the business. He didn't pay a lot of money to go to school to give you free advice. But we can offer you some free advice this morning. 648-5510. Somebody might have a question. Keep it correct, folks. Don't ask about Aunt Mary's money. But 648-5510 if you have a question and or comment. Our guest this morning, Attorney Blinn Bates, a young man whom I admire very much, and so do the people who use him, by the way. Let's talk about...
Can I ask a question?
Well, now, wait a minute. Let's talk about that. Yes, go right ahead. You may interrupt anytime. You own 51% of this show.
Yeah. Talking about trusts, I've heard the term somebody was trying to break a trust, or the term to break a trust. Why would that be? Would it be that somebody got their nose out of joint because they didn't think they got their fair share or something?
Could be. I mean, they may not like the trust. They may try to get the trust thrown out. There's a limited number of reasons that you could get a trust or a will thrown out. If there was somebody that was being pressured to sign something, for instance, or somebody that signed something that wasn't of sound mind, if they were not competent to do that.
Well, after just so many years pass, one thinks one's probably not quite as of sound of mind as they may have been,
Yeah, and I actually got
She's
into
looking
this
in my
discussion.
direction.
I got into this discussion yesterday, actually, about competence and things like that. And when you talk about competence to sign documents like that, you're talking about, do I know what I have? Do I know who I am, which is important? Do I know who the items of my bounty are, my spouse, my kids, my things like that? And do I know what I want to have happen to them? And that's kind of what it boils down to. If you get into a contested issue like that, is did that person know those things? And that's sometimes a tricky one, because with diseases of the mind, you talk about Alzheimer's and things like that. There is definitely times when people that have Alzheimer's are competent, and there's definitely times when they're not. And it comes and goes. That ebbs and flows. You never know when that's going to be. So you get into some pretty tricky issues.
Well, what if you get somebody, and you hear about this once in a while, it'll be in the news because it's a departure from normal. Somebody decides that, by golly, those 3 kids have not been an asset to me at all, and I'm leaving my estate to Bowser, my favorite dog.
It happens.
It does happen. How does it happen?
The lawyer walks.
Speaking of being of sound mind.
I guess they just get fed up.
Well, yeah, but what
How do you handle that,
ultimately happens?
Mr. Bates?
Yeah, how do you handle that?
They have, there has been historically money that's been left into a trust for the benefit of animals. People care a lot about their animals. We were talking about some of our pets before we got on the air, and I don't really intend to leave any of my dogs money, but some do. They leave money in trust, and they say, I want Mrs. Busby to be the trustee, and I want her to take the best care of Fido that she possibly can, and I want her to use this money to do it. And you hear stories about that, and it happens.
Yeah.
Well, the Chade Motel is a direct result
think
of somebody who wanted to leave their money to the dogs.
Yeah.
But that's kosher.
You can do it, yes.
Isn't that interesting? I don't have a dog.
It'd be a good gig to get if you were the trustee of a pet trust, because you would have to accompany that pet on all the lavish vacations, I think.
Oofta. Should be just a whole new world, isn't it?
648-5510. You have about 2 minutes to get your final questions and or comments. If you call in, be very nice to him. He's a great kid.
On balance, can I ask you, please?
Yes, ma'am.
For just a regular plain person, would you advise a trust or an estate?
I think, in my opinion now, the way that estates work, and it's been simplified quite a bit actually over the years, and I think it's kind of 6 one, half dozen the other. So in a trust, you're doing the work, you're incurring the expense while you're alive. In an estate, with a will, somebody's going to incur that expense and do the work when you're gone. So on a cost basis, a more financially affordable option would be to have a will and start looking at some of those things that we talked about earlier. Maybe we list some beneficiaries and we make some joint owners, and at that point there may not be anything you need to do to probate the will if you've planned accordingly. Because if there's nothing that's owned individually by the person that's passed away at the time of their death, there's really no estate that you need to handle, because the estate has been handled just by operational law.
Blinn Bates, Premier Executive at Woods and Bates. We appreciate very much you taking your time, Blinn, this morning. Your time comes dear to you because you have clients that want to see you, and they're willing to pay you decent money for that. Money which they are happy to part with because they're getting the services they expect. Thank you for covering what we did of the law this morning. You had two folks over here, neophytes in the matter of law, and so we couldn't come up with the questions that we probably should propound. So thank you very much, Blinn Bates. Be very nice to one another out there. Don't forget our wounded warriors.